Hi, my name is Samantha Good, and this is my digital presentation. I'm going to talk verbally through an overview of my paper entitled How to Choose Sides in The Blind Side. Throughout this presentation, we're going to cover a couple of things. First, we're going to start with a plot summary to familiarize any audience members who may not have seen the film The Blind Side. We'll talk through the main characters, we'll go through a brief overview of what happens during the movie, and we'll talk about the main themes. After that, we'll move forward, and once we're all on the same page, we'll talk through how the film could be used as equipment for living and what equipment for living means. And following that, we'll talk through some of the research that other individuals in the field have done and how this ties into the concept of equipment for living and some of the conclusions that they've come to. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the movie, The Blind Side is the story of Michael Orr. When we first meet Michael, he's a homeless black teen who's been abandoned by his family, and he comes from a set of very unfortunate circumstances. He's struggling academically, he doesn't seem to have a way in life, he's homeless, but despite all of that, he is accepted into a private Christian school with the hope that he will help their athletic team. So at this point is when we meet the Toohey family. The Toohey family is a wealthy Memphis family consisting of Leanne, the mother, Sean, the father, Collins, the older sister, and SJ, the younger brother. One night, as the Tooheys are driving home, they see Michael walking home in a storm. They invite him to get into their car and bring him home for the evening. From that point on, the Tooheys really adopt Michael into their family as a son. We see them providing him with opportunities that Michael has never had before, both academically and athletically. We watch as Leanne begins to invest heavily in Michael's education and athletic performance. She learns that at one point in an aptitude test, he scored high on protective instincts, which she then uses to help guide both his football career and his academic career. We watch as Michael becomes part of the Toohey family, developing strong bonds with both of his adopted siblings, and in particular his younger brother SJ. We also watch as the Toohey family endures criticism from their family and friends in the racially divided South for adopting an African-American boy. As the story continues, we see Michael earning a football scholarship to Ole Miss, as well as being courted by a number of other teams. At this point, the Tooheys' investment in Michael is starting to be questioned, and it's wondered if maybe they invested in him as a tool to become a football player at Ole Miss. After all of the courting from different football teams, Michael finally decides that Ole Miss is where he wants to go, and we see him flourish, graduate from high school, and move on to become an Ole Miss football player. One of the most important things in the story The Blind Side is that it's based on a true story, and pictured here we can see the actual Toohey family with Michael Orr, who's now a player for the Baltimore Ravens. As we watch The Blind Side and we see Michael Orr overcome all of the obstacles in his life to move on, become successful at his participation as a teammate and as a student, academically, and become a well-known professional football player, we can definitely see how this movie could be used as equipment for living. Kenneth Burke was the person who originally kind of conceptualized this concept of equipment for living, and it was really intended to be anything that somebody can take the strategy that's depicted in the work of art, whether it's literature or film, and use it to overcome something in their own life. And so as we watch Michael, and he's overcoming literally everything, every card in the deck is stacked against him, somebody could definitely use the theme of love, of perseverance, and apply that to their own life. Another thing that we really see strongly throughout the movie is this concept of identity. When we first meet Michael, he's homeless, he doesn't belong to any sort of network. He doesn't belong to what he would consider a family. He doesn't have anybody who supports him. He doesn't have a good, solid network of friends. He doesn't belong to a strong school. He doesn't belong to a strong team. And as we see Michael develop these networks, we really see him come into his own as a person who identifies as a member of those networks. So you can really see how the socio-cultural tradition is expressed through familial bonds and also through the concept of different. So as I point out in my paper, one of my favorite examples of this concept of film being used as equipment for living actually happened in 1995. So Warner Brothers, who are the producers who have the Batman franchise, became really concerned that the Batman character was becoming too dark and developing a cult-like following. And so they went through kind of a rebranding of Batman to make the concept of Batman a little bit more animated and a little bit more lighthearted. And so to me, this just really is taking the scholarly research done on equipment for living and on how different pieces of art can apply to our lives, and it's taking real life, modern day social media and tying them together, because Warner Brothers may have not even understood the concept of equipment for living, but they knew aptly enough that if their character became too dark, it would become a problem for the image and the brand. And so I just think that's really interesting that you can see that it's a really applicable concept. Types of equipment for living is a subject that's been researched by multiple people in the communications field. As I mentioned earlier, Kenneth Burke is really the person who originally conceptualized this concept as equipment for living, and kind of noted that it's anything that is applicable for somebody in real life where you could take that strategy and apply it to get through problems. Most of the research on this subject is focused on literature, but film is really the next iteration of that. Brummer also pointed out that more recently, that movies often present in real-time, realistic strategies and realistic answers to problems that people can apply to their own life, which really goes hand in hand with the way that Kenneth Burke intended for this subject to be thought of. And even more recently than that, in 1990 and 1998, there was a study and research done by two different groups of scholars. One was Cross, Jennings, and Borch, and the other one was Hesley and Hesley. I'm not sure if I'm saying that properly. But they found precedent that movies had been used in therapy sessions with children. And so that really is like encapsulating this idea of equipment for living if therapists are using it to give to children to help them work through their issues. So the last observation that I'd like to make as it applies to The Blind Side and some of our communication studies is how the socio-cultural tradition really plays in this movie. And this is one of my favorite points here. So the way that I think of the socio-cultural tradition is that it's really studying the patterns of interactions between people. And so to me, in my mind, I'm thinking of the way that your identity is with a group of people. So in a family, for example, I may be a daughter, whereas at work I may be a boss, and kind of how those things play together as I interact with other people. And so I really like the way that you see Michael's identity kind of flourish and manifest throughout the story in The Blind Side. So when we first meet Michael, and I mentioned this earlier, he really doesn't have much of an identity. He's not part of a family, he's not part of a team, he's not well ingratiated into a social group or a school. And we really see that change as he becomes part of the Chewies family. We see him really getting into the big brother role with SJ. We see him getting into the brother role with Collins, the son role as he interacts with Leanne, and then we see him interacting as a teammate and becoming the protector on the team, and that's something that Leanne had mentioned, and she really used that to help guide his coaching. And so I really like that as Michael gets these groups and these networks, he starts to develop his identity as a member of that group. So what it means for Michael the teammate, what it means for Michael the student, what it means for Michael the family, and how those things kind of manifest and work together, because it's really not just Michael figuring out who he is, but it's figuring out who he is as the interaction, kind of as a matrix interaction with those individuals and those groups. And so I really like that. I feel like the movie kind of brings that cradle to grave, the concept of the sociocultural tradition and how people develop themselves through networks. So that's everything I have on the movie The Blind Side and how it can act as equipment for living and how it shows some of the traditions of communication that we studied here in this class. Thank you for taking the time to go through my presentation this afternoon, and I've attached the references of everything that I referred to, the various different pieces of research. So thank you very much.